The world was falling apart. Fascist Nazi shock troops of the Third Reich and their blitzkrieg had spread across Europe and northern Africa and were marching their eastern front deep into the heart of Russia. The Empire of Japan was making its conquest of the Pacific reality. 65 million human lives would be lost. 11 million would eventually be systematically exterminated by an evil war machine like the world had never seen before. To gain a foothold into Europe and take on the armies of Hitler's Nazi Third Reich, the world needed a new elite type of soldier. The Paratrooper was that soldier. Changing Hearts and Minds welcomes you to a special series dedicated to the greatest generation, and specifically, the well-known story that inspired the best-selling book and HBO miniseries, Band of Brothers. Join me, Jeff Adamec, veteran of the U.S. Army where I served as a paratrooper in the 82nd, Ranger in the 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, and finally as a Green Beret in 3rd Special Forces Group, as I welcome fellow veterans, other podcast hosts and personalities, and some very special guests to honor the true story, book, and television series about the greatest generation's most honored story of sacrifice, service, and leadership in the face of overwhelming evil. Lessons in Leadership, the men and history of Easy Company. Welcome to Lessons in Leadership, Band of Brothers. This is the first episode of what is going to be a unique and a wide look at the historic events and the adaptation of those events that Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division took part in during World War II. This episode is going to be an introduction to what to expect with this series. The episodes that will follow the HBO miniseries that made the story of Easy Company and its men a globally viewed and inspiring saga. The invasion of Europe was the beginning. The long and at times seemingly unwinnable battles that they took with the SS-controlled German military, and then the eventual victory over Hitler's army and the end of his conquest of global Nazi rule. We will also talk about some behind-the-scenes and production topics on what went into the adaptation of author and historian Stephen Ambrose's book, Band of Brothers, turning it into the HBO miniseries known as Band of Brothers. Apart from this episode, each of the following episodes will be covering events of a single episode of the show. From the show's events to expanded historical info and how it was accurate or was treated with artistic license and why, to individual character focus and the episode's lessons and impacts on how they differ to viewers or make the show able to be viewed over and over again by people. We all know that have seen the show. You watch it over and over again. Why do you do that? Well, we're going to talk about that, and you'll be surprised sometimes with why you are so driven to watch this show. I also wanted to bring in other people's ideas and reflections on the show. Each one of the shows will be co-hosted by either a veteran or another podcast host. And I'm not just talking about my partners over at Change Your POV. I will be on with them, so they will all be on. But I have some hosts from other popular shows that are on podcasting. You've heard of these shows before, and they're going to be surprised at some of them. But the big, giant, unique, and honored fortune we have is we've got one of Hollywood's most well-known filmmakers and actors, retired Marine Captain Dale Dye, the owner of military consulting company for film and television Warriors, Inc., and maybe the most recognizable person on modern films dealing with combat. He's got credits for films like Platoon, Saving Private Ryan, and then HBO shows Band of Brothers in the Pacific. He gives us his memories and views on the show and his role in Hollywood that will be used throughout the entire podcast run, and it will also be released in its full entirety at the end as a bonus episode. So with the administrative business of letting you know what to expect and how this will be done out of the way, the only thing left is to start. But this episode, guys, doesn't have any co-hosts. This is the only one you'll have where it's just you and I. For many veterans and civilians, they have a limited idea of what the airborne infantry is and what it means to be able to have the title paratrooper. As a veteran, I don't know what it means to not be airborne. I joined the Army and attended airborne school at Fort Benning, Georgia, right after basic, and was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, immediately as my first duty assignment. And since then, and up until I retired, I was always a member of an airborne unit and always on jump status. But I do know that there is a specific difference between paratroopers and the rest of the Army, even if I don't know what it's like not to be a paratrooper. Paratroopers conduct themselves differently, and they're viewed by other members of the military differently. So where did the airborne paratrooper come from? In Band of Brothers, we only follow the men of Easy Company, and the show never gives any more than that in the background of the job. It doesn't take away from the show, but it would have enhanced it, I think, for you to understand the story of how these guys were so important. Aviation itself is only 40 years old, and now they were going to use a technique from that technology to deliver men into combat with which little more than an experimental level of the insertion technique. because there still trying to figure out how to use parachutes. So let's talk about a little bit of the background and deployment of military airborne units. Early parachute designs were sketched as far back as Leonardo da Vinci, but the very first successful parachute jump didn't occur until 1797, when André Jacques Garnier jumped from a balloon at a height of 3,200 feet. In 1911, a Russian named Gleb Kotelnikov invented a knapsack parachute, which was originally packed into a hard case until he perfected his soft case in 1924. The stage was now set for the military weaponizing of the parachutist. Winston Churchill, almost in World War I, was proposing airdropping infantry, and Colonel Billy Mitchell of the United States Air Corps likewise proposed similar ideas. But the first military parachutist drop, however, didn't take place until between 1930 and 1933, and the reason is the sources vary on what the year actually was. But we'll say 1930, the U.S. Army experimented with the concept of parachuting 3-man heavy machine gun teams, but nothing ever came of those early experiments. Then Russia came around, but the first drop was very small. There was only 62 parachutists. In 1936, they finally got themselves up to 1,000 parachutists jumping out of a plane. Germany would actually successfully drop paratroopers into combat for the first time in history in 1940 during the invasion of Denmark. Although airborne units were not popular with the U.S. Armed Forces, Franklin D. Roosevelt sponsored the concept and got Major General William C. Lee to organize the first paratrooper platoon. But before that, they had to actually test it. So in July of 1940, the 29th Infantry Regiment created a platoon, becoming the first U.S. airborne test jump platoon. This platoon was led by platoon leader First Lieutenant William T. Ryder, who was the first person to make a jump on August 16, 1940 at Lawson Field, Fort Benning, Georgia, from a B-18 bomber. And he was immediately followed by Private William N. King, the first enlisted soldier to make a parachute jump. Meanwhile, while all this was going on, General William C. Lee was getting himself organized, and he put himself together a provisional paratroop group, and then the United States Army Airborne Command. General Lee himself was the first commander at the new parachute school at Fort Benning in west central Georgia. So the difference was now you've got the Germans have jumped into combat, the Russians are perfecting it, Britain and the United States are finally getting on board, and between 1942 and 1943, the U.S. finally had paratroopers make multiple jumps into Africa and Italy, including the 509th, 505th, and 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment parachuted into New Guinea. This was all leading up to where the beginning of Band of Brothers starts at. The Army at the time considered the airborne elite, and even today they're considered a little bit more above regular Army. They actually looked differently in the uniforms they wore. They had what was called Cochrane jump boots, or just jump boots, and they would be allowed to take their trousers and blouse them into the boots. It's a look that you see all military fatigues wear now, but at the time, only the airborne were allowed to do this. That legacy exists even today, where Class A uniforms, airborne qualified or paratrooper qualified units, wear those jump boots and their trousers are tucked into them, even in their Class A uniforms. It's an odd look, but I recommend going online and pulling up a Google search of a paratrooper in a Class A uniform so you can get a look at it and see what it looks like itself. Also, the red berets or the maroon berets that you see in airborne units now didn't exist back then. They wore the standard cap. The only difference between the caps then was that they had a patch on the side called the UWI-0062 airborne patch that you see on the show, and you'll see on the show in any picture you pull up. But the big thing was the wings that they wore. Everybody knows that when you go through airborne school, at the end of it, you get this thing called the airborne badge or your airborne wings. And those things were famously known around the world right now. And those things were actually designed by Captain William P. Yarborough, later to become Lieutenant General Yarborough. And he was going to be the commander of the 501st Parachute Battalion. The actual description in the military records of what it looks like is an open parachute on and over a pair of stylized wings displaying and curving inward. A star and wreath are added above the parachute canopy to indicate the degree of qualification. There's 3 degrees of qualification. You have a basic parachutist, and that is without the star above the parachute. Then you have a senior, which is the star just by itself above the parachute. And then you have a master parachutist, and that's the star and a wreath around it. And that's really not important for the show to understand, but for you guys at home, if you have a star or a star and wreath, that means you're a jump master and you can control putting people out of planes. Well, guys, I don't mean to want to sell you out short, but that's where I'm going to stop with any kind of history on the airborne. You kind of get an idea that I gave you a little bit of a short history because it didn't last that long. It wasn't very long that airborne existed before World War II. As a matter of fact, it was in World War II that the actual operation was done for the first time in combat. And primarily, of all the parachute drops that have ever been done in combat, this war itself has the most. It was a very, very common used tactic by all the militaries involved. The 82nd Airborne Division, the 101st of the United States Allied Forces, pretty much perfected it. But we're going to stop there and let's going to move on to a little bit of the history behind the production of the show. So let's talk about the history of Band of Brothers, the actual book. January 10th, 1936, Stephen Edward Ambrose was born. He was an American historian and biographer of U.S. Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, and he was a longtime professor of history at the University of New Orleans and the author of many best-selling volumes of American popular history. During a visit to an Easy Company reunion in 1988, Ambrose was prompted by the actual veterans to turn their story into a book, which was titled Band of Brothers, Easy Company, 506 Regiment, 101st, From Normandy to Hitler's Eagle's Nest. And it was released in 1992 and then revised in 1994. He built it upon additional oral histories presenting from the battle to the viewpoints of individual soldiers and became his first and one of his best-selling books. The book itself is an examination of the Parachute Infantry Company from the 101st Airborne Division in the European theater during World War II. While the book treats the flow of battle, it concentrates on the lives of the soldiers in it and associated with the company itself only. So you kind of get an indication that Easy Company was the only guys out there. It wasn't true, but they were the focus of the book. It went on to be one of the most popular selling books about the events of World War II and is cited as the basis for the miniseries itself. The series was developed chiefly by Tom Hanks and Eric Jendrickson, who spent months detailing the plot outline in individual episodes. Steven Spielberg served as the final eye and used Saving Private Ryan, a film on which he and Hanks had collaborated with, to inform the series. Accounts on Easy Company veterans such as Donald Malarkey were incorporated into production to add historic detail. The cast is full of actors who have gone on to become major since it came out. Guys from Tom Hardy to Michael Fassbender, Simon Pegg, Damian Lewis, and James McAvoy all introduced these guys from Band of Brothers. It's a bunch of talented actors in the show. There was also a lot of guys that didn't make it. Mark Wahlberg was actually rumored to have initially been the actor to fill the role of Easy Company Commander Dick Winters. Damian Lewis was eventually the one to play the role. But when you break down the top acting parts, cast by nationality, there is 59 cast members from the United Kingdom, 29 from the United States, 12 from Germany, and 1 from South Africa. The show itself had 10,000 extras, 500 speaking roles, and a massive wardrobe department that supplied detailed and authentic uniforms, including 500 pairs of paratrooper jump boots manufactured to fit the original Army specifications. Band of Brothers was at the time the most expensive TV miniseries ever to have been made by any network, until it was superseded by the show's sister show, The Pacific. Its budget was approximately $125 million, or an average of $12.5 million per episode. In addition, $15 million was allocated for promotional campaign, which included screenings for World War II veterans. One was held at Utah Beach, Normandy, where the U.S. troops had landed on June 6, 1944. On June 7, 2001, 47 Easy Company veterans were flown to Paris and then traveled by chartered train to the site where the series premiered. Also, sponsoring was done by Chrysler as its Jeeps were used in the series. Chrysler spent $5 to $15 million on advertising. Using footage from Band of Brothers, each of the spots was reviewed and approved by the co-executive producers of Hanks and Spielberg. The BBC itself paid £7 million, or the equivalent of $10.1 million, as co-production partners, the most it had ever paid or bought into a program. It screened it on BBC Two. Originally it was to have aired on BBC One, but it was moved to allow an uninterrupted 10-week run. With the BBC denying that it was because the series was not sufficiently mainstream, negotiations were monitored by British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who spoke personally to Spielberg, and that shows you how important this was to the British. The series was shot over 8 to 10 months at Hatfield Aerodrome in Hertfordshire, England. Various sets, including replicas of European towns, were built. This location also been used to shoot the filming of Saving Private Ryan. Replicas were constructed on large open fields to represent 12 different towns. Among them were Bastogne, Belgium, Eindhoven, Netherlands, and Carentan, France. North Weald Airfield in Essex was also used for location shots depicting the takeoff sequences before the D-Day Normandy landings. The village of Hambledon in Buckinghamshire, England was used as a location extensively in the early episodes to depict the company's training in England, as well as in later scenes. All the scenes set in Germany and Austria were shot in Switzerland. The production team consulted with Dale Dye, a retired United States Marine Corps captain and consultant on Saving Private Ryan, as well as with most of the surviving company veterans, including Richard Winters, Bill Garnier, Frank Bercanti, Ed Heffron, and Amos Taylor. Dye, who actually plays a part portraying Colonel Robert Sink, the battalion commander, instructed the actors in a 10-day boot camp. We had the distinct opportunity to interview Dale Dye for this series, and right now I'm going to give you guys a little bit of that when we talk about his building of these guys through this 10-day boot camp.
And so Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks called me in and they said, Dale, we want you to do this. We want you to do what you normally do. But what do you need? And I said, I want, because these guys are seen from their very formation, Easy Company 506, first of the 506th, 101st Airborne Division in World War II. They're given, we see them from the time they assemble, from the time they go into basic training, all the way toward the end of the war. And so I said, I need to replicate that experience in some fashion. And I said, I want 2 weeks, and I'll take them, by the time I graduate them, by the time I bring them out, they will know what it was like to be a young paratrooper soldier in World War II. And so I designed this program that began with a long series of living in the barracks and actually I used a barracks because that's what they would have used at Toccoa,
right,
when they were originally formed, at a place called Longmoor Camp, which is very near Aldershot, which is the home of the British Army. And I was completely isolated. There was a fence around the area, completely isolated. I had our own cooks, and we fed them, and we PT'd every morning. We hunked hard all the time. We worked at night so that they would get used to that. And what happened is they began to gel. They began to know each other. They began to become a paratrooper rifle company circa 1944. And that's what I wanted. So as we worked toward the end of that training period, I made arrangements with the British Army's #1 parachute school at Bryce Norton Royal Air Force Base. And I took them up and I put them through a complete ground parachute training regimen. And the culmination of it, I couldn't actually get them out the door of an aircraft because the insurance guys were going nuts. But I got them off of a 60-foot tower. And when I brought them back to Longmoor, I conducted a graduation exercise, pinned wings on them, and said, now, we are going out to do one of the most important missions in your life, and that is to celebrate the lives and the accomplishments of the real men that you are portraying. And you will do it right, and you will do it with pride, and you will do it with the same panache and dash that they did in June of 1944. And so it worked magically, as I knew it would. And I'll never forget Steven Spielberg coming by with Tom Hanks in tow to take a look at them toward the end of training. And he just looked at me and he said, "What have you done?" and I didn't know exactly what he meant. I mean, have I screwed this up? I didn't think I did. And he was just all smiles, and he said, "They are them." And I said, "Yes, sir, they are them. And I'm going to be right at their shoulder, leading them all the way through this to see that they remain them until we get this thing made." So that's a long story, but that's essentially how I did it.
Band of Brothers received critical acclaim, mixed with just a few doubts about the handling of individual characters. Band of Brothers has also become a benchmark for World War II series. The premiere of the Band of Brothers on September 9, 2001 drew 10 million viewers. 2 days later, the September 11th attacks occurred, and HBO immediately ceased its marketing campaign. The second episode drew 7.2 million viewers. The last episode of the miniseries received 5.1 million viewers, the smallest audience, but by no means a tiny bit of people. The series was nominated for 20 Primetime Emmy Awards, won 7, including Outstanding Miniseries and Outstanding Directing for a Miniseries, Movie, or Dramatic Special. It also won a Golden Globe Award for Best Miniseries or Motion Picture Made for Television, an American Film Institute Award for TV Movie or Miniseries of the Year, a Producers Guild of America Award for an Outstanding Producer of Long-Form Television, and a TCA Award for Outstanding Achievement in Movies, Miniseries, and Specials. The show was then selected for the Peabody Award for, quote, relying on both history and memory to create a new tribute to those who fought to preserve liberty, unquote. All 10 parts of the miniseries were released on DVD box sets on November 5th, 2002. The set includes a 5-disc containing all the episodes, and a bonus disc with the behind-the-scenes documentary We Stand Alone Together, The Men of Easy Company, and a video diary of actor Ron Livingston, who played Lewis Nixon. A collector's edition of the box set was also released, containing the same discs, but held in a tin case. Band of Brothers is one of the best-selling TV DVD box sets of all time. In 2010, it had sold about 250 million worldwide. The series was released as an exclusive HD DVD set series in Japan in 2007. With the demise of the format of DVD, they're currently out of production, and Blu-ray disc versions of the show are released on November 11, 2008, and has become a Blu-ray disc top seller. So with that, guys, I think we just wrapped up episode 1. I'm not going to give you any more information because I'm trying to keep this episode to not giving away any spoilers, and I kind of have a little bit in some of these episodes when I talk about people coming back to talk about it and who was interviewed. That's okay because most people have seen the show. They'll Die is going to be inside every single episode almost as we go from here to the end. And as I said before, at the end of the entire series, I am going to put a bonus episode out of the entire interview with Dale Dye from front to back so that you don't miss anything if you want to listen to it. There's also been a teaser episode for this placed on Changing Hearts and Minds, my actual regular podcast. If you want to go there and you can look up Dale Dye's name, find the episode that he's in, and listen to it there. You can get a little bit of the stuff that doesn't apply to Band of Brothers that was in that interview. But I want to tell you guys that I'm really excited about going down this journey with you, and starting next episode, you're going to start having guest co-hosts on it. We'll start with Sam Culber, who is the host of Breakers podcast, and he'll be coming on to talk about episode 1. Thank you guys for checking in with us, and this will be posted onto the Facebook page, onto the Change Your POV podcast website. We'll talk to you guys next week. Take care.